Between 1945 and the early 1950s, thousands of German women crossed the Atlantic as war brides, leaving behind a Germany devastated by bombing, hunger, and occupation. When they finally crossed the threshold of their new American homes, often in small Midwestern towns or rural areas, and entered their bedrooms for the first time, the shock was profound and disorienting. Annalie stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still gripping the brass knob. Before her stretched a room she could not comprehend. Floral wallpaper climbed the walls in cheerful pink and cream patterns. A double bed dominated the center of the space, covered in a handmade quilt with colors so vivid they seemed to pulse. Lace curtains filtered afternoon sunlight through glass windows that were whole, uncracked, without a single board nailed across them. The floor beneath her feet was solid hardwood, not concrete or packed earth, and it was covered partially by a braided rug in shades of blue and green. She had traveled 4,000 miles to reach this Iowa farmhouse in 1947. She had crossed an ocean on a crowded ship with hundreds of other German war brides, all of them clutching their single suitcases, all of them moving toward husbands they barely knew, and a country they had only imagined. But nothing in those weeks of anticipation had prepared her for this moment. Nothing had prepared her for a bedroom that looked like it belonged in a magazine, untouched by war, innocent of destruction. Her husband, James, stood behind her in the hallway, waiting. He had been so proud when he opened the door, so eager to show her what he had prepared. His mother had helped him paint the walls. His sister had sewn the curtains. The quilt had been a wedding gift from his grandmother. He wanted her to love it. He wanted her to feel at home. But Annalie could not move. She could not step across the threshold into this space that felt more alien than anything she had encountered in America so far. Because the last bedroom she had known in Berlin had been a corner of a basement shared with 3 other families, where they slept on pallets made from coats and blankets, where the walls were damp and the ceiling was cracked, where every night they listened for the sound of bombers overhead. This was not a bedroom. This was a dream, or a museum, or a stage set for a life she did not know how to perform. Between 1945 and 1952, approximately 50,000 German women immigrated to the United States as war brides, married to American soldiers they had met during the occupation. The War Brides Act of 1945 made their passage possible, exempting them from the usual immigration quotas and allowing them to join their husbands in a country that had emerged from the war prosperous and intact. These women came from a Germany that had been systematically destroyed. Allied bombing campaigns had reduced major cities to rubble. An estimated 3.6 million German homes had been destroyed or severely damaged. In cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden, entire neighborhoods had been erased. In Berlin, where Annalie had lived, 70% of the housing stock was uninhabitable. The women who became war brides had lived through this destruction. They had survived in basements and bomb shelters. They had watched their cities burn. They had dug through rubble looking for possessions, for food, for bodies. They had learned to sleep through air raid sirens and to wake at the slightest unfamiliar sound. They had become experts in scarcity, in making do, in the mathematics of survival. And then they had met American soldiers, young men in clean uniforms who had chocolate and cigarettes and coffee, men who represented not just romance but rescue, men who spoke of a place called home where houses still stood, and families still gathered around dinner tables, and life continued in patterns that had been interrupted in Germany years before. The courtship happened in the ruins, in occupied Berlin, in Munich, in Frankfurt, in Stuttgart. American soldiers were initially forbidden from fraternizing with German civilians, but the ban was impossible to enforce and was eventually lifted. Relationships formed in the strange intimacy of occupation, where conqueror and conquered negotiated a new kind of peace. Some of these relationships were built on genuine affection. Others were more complicated, rooted in the practical realities of a devastated country, where an American boyfriend meant access to food, to safety, to a future that extended beyond the next meal. The soldiers wrote letters home describing their German girlfriends. They sent photographs. They made promises about American life. They described houses with multiple bedrooms, cars in driveways, refrigerators full of food, stores with shelves that were stocked. They meant these descriptions as reassurance, as enticement, as proof that they could provide a good life. But the German women who received these descriptions could not truly comprehend them. The gap between their reality and the America being described was too vast. They had no reference point for abundance. They had no framework for understanding a country where the war had been something that happened elsewhere, where cities were intact, where normal life had continued, even as Europe burned. When Annalee boarded the ship in Bremerhaven, she carried everything she owned in a single battered suitcase. Inside were 2 dresses, both mended multiple times, 3 pairs of stockings with runs carefully darned, undergarments worn thin, a sweater her mother had knitted from unraveled yarn salvaged from an old blanket, a photograph of her family taken before the war, when her brothers were still alive, a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. That was all. That was the sum total of her material existence. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks. The ship was crowded with war brides from multiple countries, all of them traveling toward uncertain futures. They shared cramped quarters below deck. They were seasick and homesick, and terrified and hopeful all at once. They taught each other English phrases. They showed each other photographs of their American husbands. They made promises to write, to stay in touch, to help each other navigate this new world they were entering. When the ship docked in New York, Annalee saw the Statue of Liberty through a gray morning mist. She felt nothing. She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed, too focused on the immediate logistics of disembarkation and customs, and finding James in the crowd of waiting soldiers. There was no time for symbolic moments. There was only the relentless forward motion of processing, of paperwork, of being moved from one line to another until finally she was through, and James was there, and he was smiling, and she was in America. The train ride from New York to Iowa took another 2 days. Annalee pressed her face to the window and watched the country unfold. She saw cities that were whole. She saw towns with church steeples pointing toward the sky instead of lying in rubble. She saw farmland that stretched to the horizon, unbroken by bomb craters. She saw houses with lights in the windows and smoke rising from chimneys and laundry hanging on lines in backyards. She saw a country that did not know what it meant to be destroyed. James talked during the journey. He told her about his family, about the farm, about the community she was joining. He pointed out landmarks and explained American customs and tried to prepare her for the life that awaited. But Annalee barely heard him. She was too busy trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had known. The cognitive dissonance was profound. This was the same world, the same year, the same planet, but it looked like a different universe. When they finally arrived at the farmhouse, James's family was waiting. His mother, his father, his 2 sisters, his younger brother. They stood on the porch, waving, smiling, welcoming. They had prepared a meal. They had decorated the house. They had done everything they could to make Annalee feel at home. And she tried. She smiled. She shook hands. She said the English phrases she had practiced. She ate the food even though her stomach was in knots. She performed gratitude because she knew it was expected and because she was, genuinely, grateful. But she also felt like she was watching herself from a distance, like she was an actress playing a role in a play she had not rehearsed. And then James took her upstairs to show her their bedroom, and she stood in the doorway and could not move. The bed was the first thing that undid her. It was so large, so soft. The mattress was thick, supported by box springs covered in clean white sheets and that elaborate quilt. There were 2 pillows with embroidered pillowcases. There was a bedspread folded at the foot. The bed alone contained more fabric than Annalee had seen in years. In Berlin, she had slept on the floor of a basement on a thin pallet stuffed with straw. Before that, when her family's apartment building was still partially standing, she had shared a narrow bed with her younger sister, both of them fully clothed, because there were no extra blankets, and the windows were broken, and the cold was constant. Before that, before the worst of the bombing, she had slept in her childhood bed in a room she shared with her sister, but even then, in the final years of the war, they had burned most of the furniture for heat. The bed frame had gone into the stove during the winter of 1944. The mattress had been traded for food. So this bed, this American bed with its abundance of softness and fabric and space, was incomprehensible. It was wasteful. It was obscene. It was everything she had dreamed of and everything that made her feel guilty for dreaming. The furniture was equally disorienting. There was a dresser with 6 drawers, all of them empty, waiting for her possessions. But she had no possessions. Her single suitcase would fill perhaps one drawer, maybe two if she spread things out. What was she supposed to do with the rest of the space? There was a vanity with a mirror and a small cushioned stool. There was a wardrobe with wooden hangers. There were two nightstands, one on each side of the bed, each with a small lamp. There was a rocking chair in the corner by the window. In Germany, furniture had become currency. People burned it, traded it, sold it for food or fuel. The idea of having furniture that served no purpose beyond comfort or decoration was alien. Every object in a German household had to justify its existence through utility. But here, in this Iowa bedroom, there were objects whose only purpose was aesthetic. The rocking chair was not necessary. The vanity was not necessary. The decorative items on the dresser, a small ceramic figurine of a bird, a glass dish that held nothing, these were not necessary. They were frivolous. They were the material expression of a society that had never had to choose between beauty and survival. The walls were papered in that floral pattern, pink roses on a cream background. In Berlin, walls were bare concrete or plaster, often cracked, sometimes with holes that let in the cold. If you were lucky, you might have a propaganda poster or a photograph tacked up, but wallpaper, decorative wallpaper chosen for its aesthetic appeal, was a luxury from another era. Annalie reached out and touched the wall. The paper was smooth, intact, clean. It had probably been hung recently, perhaps specifically for her arrival. Someone had spent time and money making this room pretty. The gesture was kind. It was generous. It made her want to cry. The windows had glass, both panes, intact, clean, with screens to keep out insects. The curtains were lace, white, delicate. They moved slightly in the breeze from the open window. In Berlin, windows were broken or boarded up. Curtains had been repurposed as bandages, as slings, as rope, as anything other than decoration. The idea of hanging lace in a window, of filtering light for aesthetic effect, was so far removed from Annalie's recent experience that it felt like a detail from a fairy tale. The floor was hardwood, polished, partially covered by that braided rug. In the basement in Berlin, the floor had been concrete, always damp, always cold. Before that, in the apartment, the floors had been wood, but they were scarred and dirty, and some of the boards were loose because people had pried them up to burn. Here, the floor was beautiful. It was maintained. It was cared for. Someone had taken the time to polish it, and there was heat. James explained that the house had a furnace in the basement that heated the whole building. In winter, he said, the bedroom would be warm. They would not need to wear coats to bed. They would not need to see their breath in the morning. Annalie nodded, but she could not imagine it. She had been cold for so long that warmth seemed like a theoretical concept rather than a lived reality. The room even smelled different. It smelled like fresh paint and clean fabric and the lavender sachets that James's mother had placed in the dresser drawers. It did not smell like damp concrete or mold or smoke, or the particular odor of too many people living in too small a space without adequate sanitation. It smelled like a place where people had the luxury of caring about how things smelled. James was watching her, waiting for her reaction. She knew she should say something. She knew she should express delight, gratitude, happiness. She knew this was the moment where she was supposed to throw her arms around him and thank him for this wonderful room, this wonderful life he was giving her. But she could not speak. Her throat was tight. Her eyes were burning. She was afraid that if she opened her mouth, she would start crying and not be able to stop. So she just stood there, gripping her suitcase, staring at the room that was supposed to be hers, feeling more foreign and displaced than she had felt at any point in the long journey from Berlin to Iowa. What James could not understand, what none of the American husbands could understand, was that this room represented not just a gift, but a chasm. It was physical evidence of the unbridgeable gap between their experiences. James had grown up in this house. He had slept in this room as a child. His parents had slept in a similar room. His grandparents had slept in rooms like this. For him, this was normal. This was what a bedroom looked like. This was the baseline of domestic life. But for Annalie, this was fantasy. This was excess. This was a level of comfort and security that she had not experienced since early childhood. And even then, not to this degree. Her family had been middle class before the war, comfortable but not wealthy. They had never had this much space, this much furniture, this much of anything. And then the war had come and they had lost everything, and she had spent her formative years learning that survival meant doing without, meant making do, meant never expecting comfort or beauty or ease. So standing in this bedroom, she felt not joy but vertigo. She felt unmoored. She felt like she was being asked to step into a life that did not belong to her, that she had not earned, that she did not know how to inhabit. And underneath all of that was the guilt, the crushing, suffocating guilt of knowing that her mother and her surviving sister were still in Berlin, still living in that basement, still struggling to find enough food, still surrounded by rubble. How could she sleep in this soft bed while they slept on the floor? How could she enjoy this warmth while they froze? How could she accept this abundance while they starved? James finally broke the silence. He asked if she liked it. His voice was hopeful, eager, slightly anxious. He wanted so badly for her to be happy. Annalie forced herself to smile. She forced herself to nod. She forced herself to say yes. It was beautiful, thank you. The words felt like lies even though they were technically true. It was beautiful. She was thankful. But those simple words could not contain the complexity of what she was feeling. That night, Annalie could not sleep in the bed. She tried. She lay down on the mattress, feeling it give beneath her weight, feeling the softness envelop her. But it was wrong. It was too soft. It felt like she was sinking, like she was being swallowed. Her body, conditioned by years of sleeping on hard surfaces, could not relax. Her mind, trained to stay alert for danger, could not quiet. The silence of the Iowa countryside was louder than the noise of Berlin had been. There were no sirens, no distant explosions, no sounds of other people breathing nearby. There was only the wind and the occasional creak of the house settling and the overwhelming quiet of safety. After an hour of lying rigid beside her sleeping husband, Annalie got up. She took one of the blankets from the bed and spread it on the floor beside the window. She lay down on the hard wood, pulled the blanket over herself, and finally, she slept. She was not alone in this response. Across America, in farmhouses and suburban homes and city apartments, thousands of German war brides were having similar experiences. They were walking into bedrooms that their American husbands had prepared with love and pride, and they were feeling not joy but dislocation. They were being offered comfort and responding with confusion. They were being given abundance and feeling overwhelmed by guilt. Hildegard arrived in Texas in 1946. She had been a nurse during the war, working in field hospitals, seeing horrors that she would never fully be able to describe. She had met her husband, Robert, when he was recovering from a minor injury in a hospital in Munich. He was a sergeant, older than many of the soldiers, more serious. He had promised her a fresh start, a new life far from the memories that haunted her. The house in suburban San Antonio was small but modern. It had been built just before the war, and it had all the latest conveniences: indoor plumbing, electricity, a gas stove, a refrigerator. Robert was proud of it. He had saved his military pay to make the down payment. He had furnished it carefully, wanting everything to be perfect for his new bride. The bedroom was painted a soft blue. There was a double bed with a chenille bedspread in white. There was a ceiling fan. There was a closet with a light inside. There were matching nightstands and a dresser and a full-length mirror. Robert had even bought new curtains, pale yellow with a geometric pattern that he thought was modern and cheerful. Hildegard stood in the doorway and felt panic rising in her chest. The room was so bright, so clean, so untouched. It looked like a room in a hotel, impersonal and perfect. She could not imagine herself in this space. She could not imagine sleeping here, living here, being here. It felt like a trap disguised as a gift. That first night, while Robert slept, Hildegard got up and opened the closet. She took all of her clothes out of her suitcase and hung them up, but they looked lost in the large space. So she took them down again and folded them and put them back in the suitcase, which she placed in the corner of the closet. Then she took the canned goods that Robert had shown her in the kitchen, soup and vegetables and fruit, and she brought them upstairs and hid them in the back of the closet behind her suitcase. She took crackers and bread and hid those too. She could not help herself. The instinct to hoard food, to have supplies hidden and ready, was too strong to resist. For weeks, she continued this behavior. She would take food from the kitchen and hide it in the bedroom. Robert never said anything, though he must have noticed. She also could not sleep in the bed. Like Annalie, she found the mattress too soft, the room too quiet, the safety too unfamiliar. She slept on the floor beside the bed, and when Robert asked her about it, she could not explain. She just said she was not used to it yet, that she needed time. He was patient. He did not push, but she could see the confusion in his eyes, the hurt that he tried to hide. The bedroom became a site of silent negotiation. Robert wanted it to be a sanctuary, a place of intimacy and rest. Hildegard experienced it as a stage where she was expected to perform a version of herself that did not yet exist. She was supposed to be a happy American housewife, grateful for her comfortable home, eager to start her new life. But she was still a German nurse who had seen too much death, who had lived through too much trauma, who could not simply shed her past like an old coat. Slowly, over months, she began to adapt. She started sleeping on the bed, though she always kept a blanket on the floor just in case. She stopped hoarding food in the closet, though she never stopped feeling anxious about supply. She learned to navigate the space, to make it feel less like a hotel room and more like a place where she belonged. She put a photograph of her family on the dresser. She brought in a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. She added small touches that connected her past to her present, but she never fully relaxed into the abundance. Years later, even after she had children and had lived in America for decades, she maintained habits born from scarcity. She saved everything. She wasted nothing. She kept emergency supplies hidden in various places around the house. The bedroom, with its comfort and its space, never stopped feeling slightly unreal to her, like a luxury she had not quite earned. Greta came to Wisconsin in 1948. She was younger than many of the war brides, only 19, and she had been a child when the war started. Her family's home in Hamburg had been destroyed in the firebombing of 1943. She had spent her adolescence in a displaced persons camp, and then in a series of temporary housing situations. She had never had her own room. She had never had privacy. She had never had space that was just hers. Her husband, Thomas, was a dairy farmer. His family had owned the same land for 3 generations. The farmhouse was old but well-maintained, full of furniture and objects that had been passed down through the family. Thomas's mother had died 2 years earlier, and his father had moved to a smaller house in town, leaving Thomas the farm. The bedroom that Thomas showed Greta had been his parents' room. It still contained his mother's things, her hairbrush on the dresser, her Bible on the nightstand, her clothes in the wardrobe. Greta felt like an intruder. She felt like she was erasing someone, replacing someone, taking a place that was not hers. The room was full of ghosts, both literal and metaphorical. Thomas's mother's presence was everywhere, and Greta's own ghosts, the memories of her lost home and her lost childhood, haunted her as well. She did not know how to exist in this space that held so much history that was not hers. Thomas was kind but oblivious. He did not understand why Greta seemed so uncomfortable. He thought she would be happy to have such a nice room, such a comfortable home. He had worked hard to prepare the farm for her arrival. He had painted the barn. He had fixed the fence. He had made sure everything was in good order, but he had not thought to clear out his mother's belongings. He had not considered that Greta might feel overwhelmed by stepping into a dead woman's life. It took Greta weeks to work up the courage to ask if she could move some things. She did it carefully, diplomatically, explaining that she wanted to add her own touches, that she wanted the room to reflect both of them. Thomas agreed, though she could see it pained him. Together, they packed up his mother's clothes and personal items. They stored them in the attic. They made space for Greta's few possessions, but even with the physical changes, Greta struggled. The room was so much larger than any space she had ever inhabited. The bed was enormous. The furniture was heavy and dark and old. Everything felt weighted with significance, with history, with expectations. She was supposed to become the woman of this house, the keeper of this family's legacy, but she was just a girl from Hamburg who had lost everything and was trying to figure out how to build a life from scratch. What helped, eventually, was Thomas's willingness to listen. Unlike many of the American husbands who wanted their German wives to simply assimilate and forget their pasts, Thomas asked questions. He wanted to know about Greta's childhood, about her family, about what she had lost. He wanted to understand where she came from. And in telling him, in sharing her stories, Greta began to feel less like an intruder and more like a partner. The bedroom became a place where 2 histories could coexist. where the past and the present could be acknowledged and honored. She brought in a photograph of her family taken before the war. She placed it on the dresser next to the photograph of Thomas's parents. She found a small rug at a market that reminded her of one her mother had owned. She hung it on the wall. She learned to make the bed the way Thomas's mother had, with the quilt folded just so. But she also added her own pillow, embroidered with a German folk pattern. Slowly, the room became theirs, rather than his or hers. It became a space that held both of their stories. These three women, Annalie and Hildegard and Greta, were representative of thousands. Each war bride had her own story, her own trauma, her own path to adaptation, but they shared common experiences. They all came from destruction to abundance. They all experienced the profound disorientation of stepping into American bedrooms that bore no resemblance to the spaces they had known. They all struggled with guilt, with grief, with the psychological whiplash of moving from scarcity to plenty. The adaptation process was not linear. It was not simple. It involved daily negotiations between past and present, between German identity and American expectations, between trauma and healing. The bedroom, that most intimate of spaces, became the primary site of this negotiation. It was where they were most alone, most vulnerable, most confronted with the reality of their new lives. Many war brides developed coping mechanisms. Some, like Annalie, slept on the floor until their bodies slowly adjusted to the softness of American mattresses. Some, like Hildegard, hoarded food and supplies, unable to trust that abundance would continue. Some rearranged furniture compulsively, trying to make the space feel more familiar. Some kept their suitcases packed, ready to leave at a moment's notice, unable to believe that this safety was permanent. Language was another barrier. Many war brides arrived with limited English. The bedroom became a place where they practiced, where they whispered new words to themselves, where they tried to learn the vocabulary of their new lives. But it was also a place where they could speak German, where they could write letters home in their native language, where they could maintain a connection to who they had been. The letters they wrote home were often carefully edited. They did not want to make their families jealous or resentful. They did not want to emphasize the vast difference between their new circumstances and the continued hardship in Germany. So they downplayed the abundance. They focused on the challenges, the loneliness, the difficulty of adaptation. They asked about their family's welfare. They sent money and care packages when they could. They maintained their connections even as they tried to build new ones. But in the privacy of those American bedrooms, they confronted the full reality of their situation. They had escaped. They had survived. They had found safety and comfort, and they felt guilty about all of it. Survivor's guilt is a well-documented phenomenon, but for the German war brides, it was particularly acute. They had left their families behind in a devastated country. They had married men from the nation that had defeated Germany. They were living in comfort while their loved ones struggled. The psychological burden was immense. Over time, most of the war brides did adapt. They learned English. They made friends. They had children. They became part of their American communities. The bedrooms that had initially felt so alien gradually became familiar. They learned to sleep in the soft beds. They learned to appreciate the space and the privacy. They learned to see the abundance not as a source of guilt, but as an opportunity to build new lives. But they never forgot. Even decades later, even after they had spent more of their lives in America than in Germany, they remembered those first moments of walking into their new bedrooms and not recognizing them. They remembered the disorientation, the fear, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of displacement. Those memories stayed with them, shaping how they understood themselves and their place in the world. The bedrooms themselves became repositories of history. Many war brides kept objects from Germany, small things that had survived the journey, that connected them to their pasts. A photograph, a piece of jewelry, a book, a letter. These objects lived alongside the American furniture and the American decorations, creating hybrid spaces that reflected hybrid identities. The bedrooms were not purely American and not purely German. They were something new, something created from the collision of two worlds. The children of war brides grew up in these spaces. They absorbed their mother's stories, their mother's traumas, their mother's resilience. Many of them developed their own complicated relationships with comfort and scarcity. They learned to save, to conserve, to never waste. They learned that safety was not guaranteed, that abundance could disappear, that the world could change in an instant. The bedrooms where they were conceived and born and raised were spaces marked by history, by loss, by survival. The broader implications of the war bride experience extend beyond individual stories. These women were cultural ambassadors, whether they intended to be or not. They brought German language, German customs, German food, German perspectives into American homes and communities. They complicated the simple narrative of American victory and German defeat. They humanized the enemy. They created connections across the divide of war. In many communities, war brides formed support networks. They found each other, these women who shared the experience of displacement and adaptation. They met in each other's homes, in those bedrooms and living rooms that were still being negotiated. They spoke German together. They cooked German food. They shared their struggles and their strategies. They helped each other navigate the challenges of American life while maintaining connections to their German identities. These networks were crucial for survival, both practical and psychological. The war brides taught each other English. They explained American customs. They provided emotional support during moments of crisis or homesickness. They celebrated German holidays together. They created small pockets of familiarity in a foreign land. And often, these friendships lasted for decades, providing continuity and connection throughout their lives. The American community's responses to war brides varied. Some were welcoming, curious, eager to help. Others were suspicious, hostile, resentful. The war had ended only recently. Anti-German sentiment was still strong in many places. Some war brides faced discrimination, insults, social ostracism. They were called Nazi brides, enemy women, traitors. Their children were sometimes bullied. Their husbands were sometimes criticized for marrying the enemy. But over time, most communities softened. The war brides proved themselves through their work, their dedication to their families, their contributions to their communities. They became teachers, nurses, business owners, community leaders. They raised children who were fully American, but who also carried German heritage. They built bridges between cultures. They demonstrated that former enemies could become neighbors, friends, family. The psychological legacy of the war bride experience is complex and multi-generational. The trauma that these women carried did not simply disappear. It was transmitted in various ways to their children and grandchildren. The hypervigilance, the frugality, the difficulty trusting safety, these patterns persisted. But so did the resilience, the adaptability, the strength that had allowed these women to survive and rebuild. Modern research on trauma and resilience has helped contextualize the war bride experience. We now understand that trauma is not simply an individual experience, but a social and historical one. The German war brides were not just individual women dealing with personal challenges. They were participants in a massive historical transition, navigating the aftermath of total war, occupation, displacement, and cultural collision. Their experiences in those American bedrooms were microcosms of larger historical forces. The bedroom, as a space, is particularly significant in this context. It is the most private, most intimate space in a home. It is where we are most vulnerable, where we sleep, where we dream, where we confront ourselves without the masks we wear in public. For the war brides, the bedroom became the site where all of their contradictions and conflicts played out. It was where they were most German and most American, most traumatized and most hopeful, most alone and most connected. The contemporary relevance of the war bride story is striking. In our current era of global migration, displacement, and refugee crises, the experiences of these women resonate. The challenges they faced, the adaptations they made, the resilience they demonstrated, all of these offer lessons and insights. What does it mean to leave everything behind and start over? How do you maintain your identity while adapting to a new culture? How do you process trauma while trying to build a future? How do you reconcile guilt with survival? These are not just historical questions. They are questions that millions of people around the world are grappling with today. Refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, from countless other conflict zones face similar challenges. They arrive in new countries with nothing but what they can carry. They are offered safety and assistance, and they feel grateful and guilty and disoriented all at once. They struggle to adapt to new languages, new customs, new expectations. They carry their trauma with them into new spaces, new homes, new bedrooms. The German war bride experience also speaks to broader questions about home, belonging, and identity. What makes a space feel like home? Is it familiarity? Is it safety? Is it the presence of loved ones? Is it the accumulation of personal objects and memories? For the war brides, home was not a simple concept. It was fractured, divided between the Germany they had left and the America they were trying to inhabit. The bedroom, that most personal space, became a site where they tried to reconcile these divisions, to create a sense of home that could hold all of who they were. Annalay eventually learned to sleep in the bed. It took months, but gradually her body adjusted. She learned to appreciate the softness, the warmth, the comfort. She learned to see the room not as a source of guilt, but as a gift, as evidence of her husband's love, as a foundation for building a new life. She brought in objects from Germany, photographs and letters and small mementos. She added her own touches to the decoration. She made the space hers, but she never stopped writing to her family in Berlin. She sent money regularly. She sent care packages with food and clothing and medicine. She sponsored her sister's immigration to America several years later. She maintained her connections, her responsibilities, her identity as a German woman, even as she became an American wife and mother. The bedroom held all of these identities. It was where she was most herself, in all of her complexity and contradiction. Decades later, in the 1980s, Annalie sat in that same Iowa bedroom, now redecorated several times but still recognizable. Her husband had died. Her children were grown. She was an old woman looking back on a long and complicated life. She thought about that first day, standing in the doorway, unable to move. She thought about how foreign and impossible it had all seemed. And she thought about how she had done it anyway, how she had walked through that door, had learned to inhabit that space, had built a life in a place that had once seemed unimaginable. The bedroom was full of photographs now, her children, her grandchildren, her life in America, but also photographs from Germany from before the war, from the world she had lost. The room held her entire history, all of the pieces of her identity arranged in careful balance. It was no longer a foreign space. It was hers. It was home, but it had taken a lifetime to make it so. The story of the German war brides and their American bedrooms is ultimately a story about resilience and adaptation. It is about the human capacity to survive trauma, to cross impossible divides, to build new lives from the ruins of old ones. It is about the courage required to walk through a door into an unknown future. It is about the daily work of making a foreign space feel like home. It is about carrying the past while embracing the present. It is about the complexity of identity, belonging, and survival. These women walked into bedrooms they did not recognize, and slowly, painfully, courageously made them their own. They transformed spaces of disorientation into spaces of belonging. They created homes that honored both their German pasts and their American presence. They raised children who carried both heritages. They built bridges across the chasm of war. And they did it all in the most intimate, most private, most vulnerable space of all, the bedroom where they slept, dreamed, remembered, and hoped. If you found this story as powerful and moving as we did, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. There are thousands of untold stories from history waiting to be discovered, and your subscription ensures you won't miss a single one. If you're already part of our community, we'd be incredibly grateful if you could hit the like button. It helps us reach more people who appreciate these deep dives into the human experiences behind historical events. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you have a family story about immigration, adaptation, or starting over in a new place? Did your grandparents or great-grandparents face similar challenges? Share your thoughts, your stories, your reflections. These conversations keep history alive and remind us that behind every statistic, every historical fact, there are real people with real struggles and real courage.